Agriculture, Food Systems and Bioeconomy Research Centre of the Rhine Institute and the University of Galway. Our institute has, or our research centre has about 30 PIs who work from farm to fork on a whole range of very diverse topics related to food systems, related to agriculture, and of course bioeconomy as well. And I'm delighted to introduce Peter Jackson and Katie Berthon, who are working on a truly interdisciplinary project, maybe always have worked in an interdisciplinary fashion. And you're going to talk to us today about the H3 project. Peter, I met a few years ago up in Sheffield. Peter is a professor of geography and the co-director of the University of Sheffield's Institute for Sustainable Food. Peter, I hope I'm representing you correctly by saying you're a social scientist. You study geography, human geography, and you've written some really amazing work on commodity culture and food in particular around that. So you lead a lot of very cool interdisciplinary research on food systems in the UK. Katie, we haven't met before, but I'm really excited to hear from you. You're a researcher in the University of Cambridge, the Department of Zoology, and you work on conservation and pollinator ecosystems and ecology, if I have that correct. I read on your biography that you work on this really cool area of wildlife in human-dominated spaces, which, you know, food systems really is, I suppose, and that you're working on the environmental benefits related to this H3 project that you're going to tell us about. So over to you, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Anne, for that very nice introduction. So Katie, I think, is going to share our slides, and it's going to be a double act with me starting and finishing and Katie doing some of the environmental science in the middle.
I will get this correct in a second.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, thank you. So Anne's asked us to talk about the H3 project as a whole, very briefly, which is part of the Transforming UK Food Systems programme, and then to focus specifically on the work package that Katie's involved, well, we're both involved in, on regenerative agriculture. So next one, please, Katie. Oh. Here we are, thank you. Yeah. So the H3 project is one of the 4 big consortia funded by the Transforming UK Food Systems programme. That's in its 5th year now. And all of the projects in Transforming UK Food Systems had to be interdisciplinary, taking a food systems approach, combining natural and social science, addressing both health and environmental aspects of food systems, and then undertaking academic research that was relevant to policy and practice. And there's a recent special issue of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, Series B, which has papers from across the Transforming UK Food Systems programme, but also has a final paper which is trying to sum up the kind of relevance for policy and practice in a section called Key Action Areas. And H3's specific focus within TUKFS is transforming food systems from the ground up. This is a rather corny phrase that we invented or reinvented, but the idea is we try to link changes in the soil to changes in food and therefore to the health of the people who consume that food. So next one, please, Katie. This is the crazy diagram we invented to summarize the H3 project. If you read sort of from left to right to start with, the arrows on the left are the kind of policy drivers which UKRI identified as what Transforming UK Food Systems ought to be involved in. If you go to the right-hand side of the diagram, you see how our projects try to go across the food system from production to consumption. The then rainbow colours in the middle are the 6 work packages, of which work package 3 is the one we're going to talk about today. There were then 3, we called them cross-cutting themes, methodological, to do with consumption and to do with engaging with wider publics. And then the final double-headed arrow is to show how we were not just academics working in a vacuum, we were engaging with stakeholders, including the 2 farm clusters we'll talk about in a moment. And they were involved from the co-design phase before the project was even funded, right through to the legacy, which will run on into next year. So it's a rather compact diagram, but it tries to show where this particular work package fits into the bigger whole. So if we move on to the next slide, we're going to focus today on regenerative agriculture. Most of you will know what it is. It sounds as if some of you are farmers who are actually practicing it already, which is great. And we're focusing really on what we call the transition to regenerative agriculture. You'll see as we go along, it's not a kind of single journey or a linear path. People are at different phases in this so-called transition. And there are many different practices combined in different ways, which might count as regen. But we think this is a good work package to focus on because it's, I think, probably the best example we have of combining environmental scientists and social scientists, and we'll try and illustrate that in a moment. You'll all be aware there's no clear definition of regenerative agriculture, but there is an emphasis on minimal soil disturbance and other sustainability principles. And probably the most widely shared set of principles is that by Groundswell, and they're illustrated there in that little diagram on the right-hand side. Our project is run from the University of Sheffield, but involves colleagues from half a dozen universities, including Cambridge, where Katie is. But we're also particularly closely working with colleagues on the Fix Our Food programme, working at the Leeds University Experimental Farm. And there is a joint report available on that work, which you see referenced there on the slide. So what we're going to do now is present just quickly some of our key findings from, if you like, the environmental science side of the project, and then I'll wrap up with some of the social science findings and a quick conclusion. So over to you now, Katie.
Great. Sorry, I have had a bit of a cold, so I might cough or croak at some point, but I'll try my best. Can I check if I switch over to my notes? Are you still seeing slides? Or are you seeing notes at the moment?
We're still seeing slides.
Perfect.
We're on the Groundswell slide at the moment, Katie.
Perfectly
That's it.
in secret, but now I've revealed my hand at the same time. So the work package 3 is an experiment that's co-designed with farmers to test the impacts of transitioning to regenerative agriculture in situ on real working farms. And the idea at the beginning was to have a before-after control impact design where we had 3 categories of farmers that were regenerative already and had been regenerative for at least the last 3 years, farmers that were conventional and were dedicated to staying conventional, at least for the term of the experiment, and farmers that might be willing to transition during the project from conventional practices to regenerative practices. And the strength of this is that it is an interdisciplinary project and it's co-designed with farmers, because regenerative agriculture is as much a social movement as it is a farming system. So it didn't make sense to look at it from just the purely mechanistic process. And because the definition is so vague and it means different things to different people, it depends on the farming context. So rather than being prescriptive as researchers, we decided to ask farmers what their definition of regenerative agriculture was. And at the beginning of the project, we defined it, these broad categories of regenerative, conventional, and transition through the practices that farmers were willing to undertake or uptake as part of regenerative agriculture. So we started by asking farmers what was the best practice farming in their particular context. And we're working across 2 farming clusters in the east and southeast of England. And what we found initially was that there was some overlap, but there were different practices that the different clusters suggested as different regenerative practices. So the final list that we came up with in terms of measuring the transition was a combination of practices that both farming clusters agreed were regenerative in their particular context, that regenerative farmers were already implementing, and that transition farmers were willing to uptake. But unfortunately, the nice clear 3 categories became very complicated very quickly. And the first indication of that was actually that we had some preliminary work that was a survey of 297 UK farmers in that, and it was on sustainable farming for soil management, because the term regenerative agriculture was not quite as prominent at the time that the survey was undertook. But what we found was that almost everybody says that they're a sustainable farmer or they're sustainably managing their soil, but the actual practices that they were implementing are very different. And there was a diverse set of practices. In our farms, in our current experiment, we find the same thing. Each of our H3 farms has a unique fingerprint, we like to say, of practices, which is what this diagram shows. Can everyone see the mouse? That might be helpful for indicating. Great. So each column here is a different farm, and each row is a different practice. And so these are some of the practices that were agreed on by farmers as regenerative practices in our experiment. And what we see is that there is actually a gradient. So each of these boxes indicates how frequently a farm implemented regenerative agriculture on their farm, so herbal lays or crop residues on their farm over the last 5 years. So the darker the color, the more consistently the practice was implemented, the lighter the color, and in theory, the white is completely, they'd had no implementation of that practice. What you might be able to see is also we have these 3 categories. In pink, we had our control, our regen, and our change, and farmers were self-enrolling into these categories at the beginning of the project. But what we actually find is that there's a gradient. So on the left-hand side here, these farms have more implementation of regenerative agriculture, these farms have less. And the categories that we have don't line up perfectly. So what we would expect is that more regenerative would be all our regen farms, but actually some of our control farms are fairly regenerative already, and some of the transition farms were already on their way towards the regenerative spectrum. So what we've done is that we've taken this gradient and we've tried to describe it using a scoring system. And we are using the scoring system going forward to measure the impact on various measures of soil health and biodiversity. So we've been measuring water stable aggregate. It's worth, I guess, saying at this point a slight detail, but I think, did I put, there should be a little QR code. That's the methods paper in the bottom right. If you want to find our exact measures and what we actually were measuring on the ground, that's a more detailed description. But in general, we measured soil health through earthworm counts and water stable aggregate fractions. We're measuring biodiversity through counting birds, spiders, and beetles and pollinators. And we're also measuring inputs that farmers are putting on their farm, the actual practices that they're implementing, and then the nutrient content of the grain as additional measures. I haven't got results from all of those for you today, but I can give you a little bit of an overview so far. But first, I want to go into a little bit more detail on this scoring system. So that gradient can be explained. So what we've done is taken the 5 principles of regenerative agriculture, matched them to the practices that farmers are implementing, and then we generate a score by summing the relative frequency of the constituent practices over time. So you get a score between 0 and 1 for each principle. So for example, increased soil cover is related to putting crop residues in, having herbal lays, and increasing cover crops. So a score of 1 for increased soil cover would mean a farm was always retaining crop residues. They had a herbal lay in the rotation every year, and they had cover crops on all of their field, or catch crops before their spring crops, and catch crops before their winter crops. So they were maintaining cover to the best of their ability based on the practices we have here. And you can see how this can be flexible if there were other practices in a different context, such as in the fens or in a different system, like in dairy, where you can vary what the practices are that are actually meeting the principles. You could potentially even modify the principles for something like dairy farming, where there might be a principle for livestock health that you would want to include. And so once we've summed the frequency, you can either take each of these principal scores individually and then compare them to the outcomes, like I have here. So for earthworms, we have, this is comparison of the earthworm density per farm across soil type, soil cover scores. And you can see that there's a positive association. So more soil cover means more worms, or you can aggregate these together. So you get a score out of 5 for all the principles. And that's something that is shown in the paper that's linked here. It's part of the paper that was with Fix Our Food and how we define and measure regenerative systems. Then as a brief introduction to some of the other results, I just have a few of the outcomes that we've looked at so far. So we've got improved soil health and carbon storage. We've got increases in earthworms and 60% improvement in soil structure. Those are actually under, if you split it and put them back into categories, you find that compared to conventional, there's a 70% increase in a fully regenerative system, and that there's increases in birds. But birds are responding more to diversity, crop diversity, and soil cover, whereas soil health outcomes respond more to soil cover and minimizing disturbance principles. The effects of insects is strongly influenced by landscape features, but we are seeing some increases in spiders and parasitoid wasps. Pollinators and carabid beetles tend to respond more complicatedly and are more related to the actual use of herbicide and other chemicals, as well as the implementation of agri-environment schemes on the farm. So regenerative agriculture is not a replacement for other habitat conservation measures for insects at this point, is what we're finding. But there are some increases in abundance. Farms that are regeneratively using less mineral fertilizer, and they are less likely to use insecticide. And there is a sign that we're getting decreased yields, but the picture is complicated because there's decreased inputs, which might mean decreased costs. So we have to do analysis of long-term productive capacity and margins. And it tends to be not that within a crop, yield is not changing very much, but farmers that are regenerative tend to use crops like peas and beans and spring crops that actually produce less yield. So this decrease in yield tends to be because of a move to different crops rather than necessarily decline. So winter wheat that's farmed regeneratively has almost the same yield as a farm that is conventional. And over to you, Peter, for the social science.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. So as well as doing the environmental monitoring that Katie's just reported on, we thought it was important to get farmer perspectives on these changes. And we've done 2 sets of interviews with both clusters in the east and southwest of England, the first in 2022 and the most recent in June this year. And we'll say a little bit more about even a 5-year project like ours is probably not long enough to measure the impact of the practices that are changing, but it's better than many projects who have an even shorter time span than we do. And there are some interesting changes between the 2 waves that I'll just try and capture in a few words. In the first wave, we showed the range of motivations that farmers had for making a transition to regen ag. They included their wish to benefit environment, and particularly soil health, but also the economic drivers where input costs were going up very rapidly during this period, and where a move to regen ag might reduce the costs of those inputs. As well as environmental and economic, I have put it on the slide, but there are also a range of what we talked about as emotional reasons for wanting to change. That was things like leaving the farm in a better state for future generations, for example. And there's a paper in Journal of Rural Studies that provides a lot more detail than I'm able to provide at the moment. There was a lot of discussion about the contrasts or the similarities between regen and organic farming, where organic farming has a clearer definition, which leads to accreditation by the Soil Association, for example, and therefore the ability to gain a commercial premium. And I think our farmers were ambivalent about that. Katie talked about it being a social movement as well as a change in practices. And one of the issues with organic, I think, is does the accreditation move you away from social movement towards something more narrowly defined and where there are commercial implications. Another key issue in the first round of interviews was the really volatile set of circumstances in which our research was proceeding. So the war in Ukraine, the rapidly rising cost of inputs, uncertainty and then changes in the policy environment with the withdrawal of sustainable farm incentive payments, the huge controversy that still goes on about inheritance tax and so on. So even if we were measuring change over a 5-year period, isolating what are the effects of regen ag compared to all these other things, haven't even put weather and climate on that list, but everything is in flux, I think, so it's quite hard to determine causality. So the first round of interviews showed quite a lot of ambivalence towards regen ag, even among these 2 farm clusters that were to varying degrees committed to regen ag. So, for example, there were lots of references to muck and magic, sandal-wearing hippies, crazy talk around compost teas, a fine line between evidence and witchcraft, and so on. So a lot of ambivalence, I think, describes it quite well. And I think that's tended to drop away over before the second set of interviews, where regen ag is now much more a part of the popular discourse, I would say. It's more commercial players are coming in. There's more political support than there was before, although the policy environment is still very changeable. The second round of interviews, which we've just completed over the summer, and which we're still analysing. I think one of the key things which has come out this time that didn't come out a few years back was that what I call different temporalities, so different time horizons associated with different parts of this transition. So, for example, farmers will talk about how long it takes for regen practices to have an impact, and how that compares with the very short-termism of both commercial markets, but also policy shifts at DEFRA and elsewhere. So they say that the impact of these changes will take a lot more than 5 years to assess, maybe 15 to 20 years, which unfortunately we don't have the funding for on our project. That's a very quick snapshot of social science research and kind of how it fitted in. But I think the other thing that was very nice, in a recent meeting, we were having discussions about these different temporalities, and Katie's findings show something similar. So while there are trends over a 5-year period, there are also big fluctuations from year to year. So we're hoping in round 2 of our results, which probably also go to the Journal of Rural Studies, that we'll be able to really combine social science and environmental science results, as well as just ways of thinking. So if we go to the next slide, which is the last one, I think we're just about on time. But we've shown, I think, that regenerative agriculture includes a diverse range of practices combined in interesting and complex ways, as Katie's diagram showed. And it's probably better to think about multiple pathways rather than a single journey or a kind of linear transition from so-called conventional to regen ag. Our farmers described this as an experimental process. One said there's no rule book. Another one said every day on the farm is a school day. You're learning something every day. It's very much an experiment, as Katie was saying. The reduction in inputs was justified on both economic and environmental grounds, not one thing or the other. Uncertainty in the policy environment is clearly key, as the other range of things which I talked about just now. And I think our final point is that you'll be aware that the government is engaging in a new food strategy. It published its general principles a couple of months ago. There's not much reference to regen ag in that policy document at all. There's one reference to soil health. But I think it's useful for us to think in terms of how the Labour Party manifesto promised public sector food procurement would be at least 50% local, by which they meant British, and or produced to high environmental standards. So as that food strategy moves forward to its more implementation phase, I think that's at least one place at which we could make a case for more widespread adoption of regenerative practices. I think there was a final slide, which is just sort of contacts for us. So if you want to put that up, Katie, that'll be good. So the website has links to all of our publications. There's a couple of videos, of which the project update is the most recent one, and then our email addresses are there as well. And I think miraculously we're on time, so thank you.
Perfect. No, thank you very much, Peter and Katie. That was really interesting, and I like very much how you pitched it. It was just a very, very interesting level, I think, for the diversity of people who are here. I'd like to open it up to the floor to ask, if you have a question, please either raise your hand if you'd like to present it, or put it in the chat box if you'd like me to present it on your behalf. Could I ask just a first quick question about the kind of demographic of the farmers and farming families who had already adopted regenerative farming, who were kind of thinking about it? I'm just wondering about the age of those farmers, the kind of farming systems they had, whether they were operating purely on kind of a commercial basis, or was it hobby farming? Could you give us a flavour of what kind of demographic was emerging from your 3 groups, or was it evenly spread?
Katie, do you want to have a go at that first?
I can take that, yeah. So I think most of the farmers that are a part of our project we have a range, but not a huge range. Most of them are older farmers. There are white men that have been farming, so they're older generation farmers. We have a couple of younger generation or new farmers that have come in, and during the project, actually, we've had a couple of farms where the management has been handed over, is in the process of being handed over to the next son, or the son is taking over the farm. And there's some interesting changes in management that you can kind of track through the practices, and you can sort of see the point that the farm gets taken over and how management is changed. But in terms of in the east, they were mostly arable farms. we have a couple of big commercial farms, but lots of them are family holder farms, so smaller farms, not as small as hobby farms. So they are all quite commercial, larger farms. We've got a couple of really big estate farms that are included in that, but lots of them I would say are sort of medium size. I think, Peter, you have figures somewhere in the paper, I think, with what the actual size is, and I can't remember the hectares. But in the east, it was mostly arable, and then they contract out for sheep to come in to do the grazing and livestock integration part of the regenerativeness. Whereas in the southwest, there were already mixed farms. So a lot of the ones that were already on that end of the conventional spectrum that I was showing before in the diagram were the mixed farms in the southwest, where they have very shallow soils. And so they would have stopped ploughing like 10 to 20 years ago. And so they were already doing min-till, they were already mixed farming, so they already had livestock integration. But by and large, quite a lot of our farmers are at the stage where they're close to retiring, I would say, and then sons are taking over. Yeah.
Yeah, but some of the most active farmers, including those who lead the clusters, are, what are they, in their 30s or 40s? So some younger. I think it's a diverse group. They're not hobby farms, and they're all people who've joined a cluster. So again, that gives an indication of their interest in working with each other, and they volunteered to join H3, so they're interested in the role of academic research as well. This case is that they're all men, although the two cluster conveners are both women, and we interviewed them as well. And there's quite a lot of discussion about generational change. My son's been to farm college. He has all these new ideas. I've been doing this for years and have the benefit of experience. So lots of that discussion going on, and also quite a bit of discussion in terms of the inheritance tax and how that might impact in the near future as well. So yeah, demographically, it's a mixed bag, and some of the interviews were joint interviews with father and son. So that was a really interesting dynamic as well.
It's I'm doing a project at the moment on perceptions around sustainability of dairy farmers in Ireland, and just what's striking me, I suppose, coming from it, is that the environmental and the economic, the very highly quantitative aspects of dairy farming are of less concern when you talk about sustainability to the social sustainability. If you look at those three pillars, if you believe in those three pillars. And the issue really with Irish farmers, dairy farmers in particular, is generational renewal. And there's real concern in the community about that that side of things. I wanted to just ask Charlie's question. He would ask himself, but he's on a plane, he's typing. And Charlie's question is, he said, super talk and project Peter and Katie, we all agree. Is there any standardized monitoring framework with agreed indicators emerging to measure the regeneration effects? So I suppose this kind of goes back to the quantification of it. Are there indicators that are measurable, monitorable? Is there a framework that is currently in use? Or formalised at least?
The quicker answer is no. DEFRA keeps saying, oh, you need to have a single measure of this stuff in order for us to incentivise or reward. And our work has tried to show the complexity of it, hence the need for this more this metric, which Katie and Lynn on the project have got. But perhaps you should answer that, Katie, rather than me.
Oh, that's okay. It is a short answer, no. So in terms of ours is sort of the first, it's not the first attempt at trying to parameterize this. There were a couple of attempts previously where researchers have tried to put a framework around what is regenerative, but I think they have fallen flat because they've been disconnected from the realities of what farmers were actually doing. And the thing that was missing from previous frameworks in terms of scoring regenerativeness was that they were adding up the number of practices without really considering what the practices were offering. So I think matching the principles to the practices to what actually they're achieving in terms of outcomes and principles is the missing part, which we're trying to solve in a way. But in terms of measurement of what the actual outcomes are of regenerative agriculture and indicators, soil health is a tricky thing to measure, and there's no agreement on what actually is a good indicator of what soil health is, or the best indicators for soil health. Similarly, biodiversity and conservation scientists argue about what the best measure of diversity is and at what level you should be measuring diversity. So I think there's no agreement, but I'm hoping that our regenerative scoring system helps build a framework, at least for measuring how regenerative a farm is and tracking progress, and then using that to help inform what outcomes are actually changing and in which direction related to the practices that are being put in place.
Yeah. Even over a 5-year period, the link between changing practices and outcomes or yield or impact is hard to measure. So there's a time period constraint, if you like. One of the things that Jonathan Leake, who's a colleague on this project, the soil scientist here at the University of Sheffield, has been trying to do is find simpler ways, cost-effective ways for farmers to measure soil health. And has he published it already, Katie, or is it on its way? I know he's been doing some sort of road shows and things at farming events and so on to demonstrate them. They are very low cost, approximate, but still worth having, I think.
Yeah, not published yet, but it is it's out there and it's coming soon. I think we talked about putting it into a proper paper format last meeting.
I'm just going to ask my colleague Alex de Menezes in a moment. Alex works on soil science and soil microbiology. He's got a question, but Freya, who's one of our great undergraduate students, has asked a question. Very interesting talk. Just out of curiosity, what was plant species richness assessed on the regenerative agriculture farms? If so, what was the outcome? So, question about plant species richness.
That's a really great question. We have monitored for weeds inside them, and I have some data, but I haven't looked at the direction of which way it's gone. My gut feeling would be that there's more diversity on regenerative farms because they're using less herbicide. Whether that plant diversity is what you would want in terms of plants, and then trying to convince farmers that extra plant diversity is good for pollinators. There's a large amount of people really don't like thistles, for example, but bees love them. So my feeling would be that plant diversity is increasing, particularly in terms of the infield where you have less herbicide use. But what we're finding is actually regenerative farms aren't using any less herbicide than a conventional farm. So I think it depends a little bit on the farmer and the particular context, but we will have results from that, hopefully, in the future.
Great. We look forward to that. Alex, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so excellent talk and excellent project. Thank you very much for talking to us. So I have a few questions, but because I'm a microbiologist, I'm going to ask a microbiology question. Did you measure any microbial variable in the soils, or was it mainly just invertebrates and proper non-microbial variables? And did you see any results with the application of regenerative agriculture over the 5 years in terms of the microbial communities or microbial properties that you measured?
Unfortunately, we haven't been able to measure microbial diversity. We've been limited to earthworms and to water-stable aggregates because we were using water-stable aggregates as the idea that the bacterial and other activity increases, and then there you get that sort of a signal that there's increased activity. So in a way, we are showing through increased water-stable aggregates that there's increased activity, but it's obviously a tenuous link rather than actually monitoring the community itself. We had grand plans to try and do that. We do have soil samples still where it could be possible, but I think they might be. I'm not a soil scientist. I'm an ecologist, so I'm wondering whether it's possible to. We have a little bit of extra capacity to do something extra with those samples if there was still a good reason to look at the microbial activity. But I'm expecting that you probably would need to collect fresh samples. And because of the logistics of it and getting samples from down near Salisbury up to Sheffield, we haven't been able to do the microbial part of that, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Do you have any response to that, Alex? Have you done any research on a similar kind of design?
Well, I've seen studies where people increase plant diversity in grasslands and we see changes in microbial community. And you also I've seen papers where people saw increased plant diversity, like having mixed species grasslands, allowing for greater yields when you're having low input systems, right? You cannot match a high input system. Well, I think it's hard to match a high input system by just increasing plant diversity. But if you're talking about low fertilization systems, then increasing plant diversity can increase yields. So I think that's possible, but that's not exactly regenerative agriculture. That's just, having a normal grassland and you add more add more species to it. So I'm not entirely sure. That's why that's why I was asking. I was wondering whether you were able to capture any of the changes in microbial community, and especially functional groups associated with nutrient cycling and decomposition and so on. But that it can only do so much.
I guess the question is, if we still have soil samples that we collected in February, is there any point in trying to do a microbial analysis now, or are they too old?
If they were frozen, then you could. If they're fresh, probably not worth doing. Like, you could do it and you might get some results from it, but then you will be struggling to publish them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'll approach that with Jonathan when we get back to him.
Thanks, Alex. Tima has a question. Tima is one of our students who's working on the Leg for Dev project I mentioned earlier, Peter, before you joined, Katie. Leg for Dev is a big food systems project across 4 countries in Africa, looking at the legume supply chain. And Tima, like myself, is a good old nutrition scientist. Tima's question is, in one of the figures you presented, the different regenerative agricultural practices, Team is interested to know the % adoption of the different practices among the farmers. So I guess that goes back to your heat map. Yeah, do you have a kind of a broad brushstroke idea of what proportion of practices were adopted by different farmers?
I don't have the exact figures. So anything I say would be a guess because I haven't looked exactly at the figures in terms of percentages. But I would say that most farmers do retain crop residues, including the conventional farmers. So I'd say that's probably up towards something like 80% of farmers do adopt that practice. Cover crops and livestock integration is lower, and herbal lays are very rare. So I would say that herbal lays are taken up by 1 in 5 farmers, maybe. Our regenerative not all of our regenerative farmers use herbal lays, which was disappointing to find when we were doing the actual maths behind the scoring and trying to make sure that we had regenerative farms compared to conventional farms. I don't think I can make any better statements than that in terms of regen practices being adopted, and the exact percentages. I could have a quick look and see if I can get that up while we're chatting about other things.
Okay.
It's quite tricky to talk in terms of percentages because it's a small, we have two clusters of how many farms altogether? 20 something farms altogether. So that's why, even in answer to your question, Anne, at the beginning about generational change and demographics, we're hesitant to do that because in the first round of the Journal of Rural Studies paper, we were asked, give us a bit more generational data. And was it that the older farmers did this and the younger farmers did that? And it's quite hard to make those generalizations based on a small number. So we're more confident about talking about, if you like, diversity. So the diversity of farmers and farming practices, even within 2 clusters, is quite striking. And they're clusters that are on different soils types as well and grow different crops as well. So there's lots going on. And it's quite, we could definitely say the percentage of practices across our 2 clusters and which practices were more prevalent than others, and as Katie's hinted, what combinations of practices are common. But it's even a qualitative social scientist like me hesitates to use even percentages or anything more fancy in terms of statistical analysis for such a small group of people.
Cohort. Cool. There are 2 more questions in the chat box. That's okay. And there's a controversial one. Is regenerative agriculture not another buzzword for farmers? Do farmers see any difference with other practices such as conservation agriculture? I found one of your slides there, about the sandal wearing hippies. Quite amusing, Peter. But I was wondering, how do your farmers respond to the term regenerative agriculture? Is it with cynicism or, generally speaking, positivity?
I think it's a range, but I think these are farmers who are kind of signed up to our project, which is focusing on regen ag. So there are one of the responses has been, this is a buzzword. That phrase has been used. We've been doing this stuff for years, and regen ag is a word that's kind of caught on in the last few years. So there's a degree of cynicism. It's nothing new. We've been doing it forever. As I say, I think there's been a change even within those 3 years for people who were quite dismissive or derogatory about those who champion regen ag. It is a kind of buzzword, but it gathers together a set of practices that people like Groundswell at least have called regenerative. I think there's also some, not cynicism, suspicion among our interviewees about the extent to which this can be commodified, or big companies can claim that now X% of our potatoes or whatever are grown regeneratively. So there's a worry about a kind of commercial capture of the idea, which I was kind of hinting at in the comparison with organics as well. Katie, you probably have a better answer than that from mine.
No, I think that's about correct. Like most of the farmers, we had one of our clusters, I think more so than the other, has been their conventional is more regenerative than the other clusters conventional is. And so they were sort of saying, well, we already kind of all are regenerative, if you want to use that word, but they wouldn't have used the word regenerative, I think, before the project started, whereas now the term is more popular. In terms of what it means, in terms of its overlap with conservation agriculture, I think there is a lot of overlap, and there's some idea that this is sort of, it's not a new concept, it's just sort of a rehashing of an old concept. But I think there's definitely more of an emphasis towards inputs related to that. So conservation agriculture is around tillage, but there's also the principles didn't include reduced inputs, but I'd say more farmers nowadays would say that regenerative agriculture includes reduced inputs as an additional principle as well.
But there's quite a good literature on this in terms of the differences between sustainable, organic, regen, and especially agroecology, where there's a lovely paper. It's called Regenerative Agriculture, Agroecology Without the Politics, or something like that, might be the precise title. But there's definitely kind of different groups of farmers who would present themselves in different kinds of ways, who see themselves committed to different kind of political kind of campaigns. Or
it's very. Do you know who wrote that paper, Peter?
I can find it for you. I'll send it on. Yeah, it's in the references in the Journal of Rural Studies paper, but I'll do that. Yeah.
Thank you. There's another
to answer
question.
A previous question, sorry.
Oh yeah, of course.
In terms of the percentages, so I've done a small calculation of so everybody has spring cropping, which is a practice. In terms of the crop residues, about 90% of farmers retain their crop residues all the time. And I'd say about I'm trying to do these backwards because what I've actually calculated is the number of farmers that don't do it. So 26% of farmers don't do any kind of min-till, which would mean, what is that? 74% do. And then in terms of applying organic residues, actually 60% of farmers don't do it. So about 40% of farmers are applying crop residues or integrating livestock. Actually, integrating livestock is 60% and organic residues is much lower. Herbal lays are very, very low adoption. There's about 26% of farmers that would say they adopt herbal lays, and then cover cropping is about 53%.
Thank you, Katie. I think that's above and beyond your.
Yeah, that's very impressive. Instant analysis. I love it.
Thank you. There's just another question I'd like to ask in the chat function. I think you mentioned that the government wants outcomes that could be measured if they were to reward improvements. Is this correct? If so, what long-term metrics out to 2050 what long-term metrics would you recommend would be useful for both public and private sector to start aligning behind? So I hope
I have a first stab at, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
that
please
is
go
the
for it.
case. DEFRA would like to support sustainable regenerative practices. It feels it's hampered at the moment by the fact that there's no easy metric. I mentioned that thing about in the Labour Party manifesto about a minimum 50% public procurement, either local, by which they mean national, or improved environmental. The working group that is looking at that, which I'm on at the moment, is desperately trying to find metrics it can use, and the metrics have to be easy. They're probably going to be self-administered for cost, and then there has to be some kind of monitoring and evaluation to make sure that what's reported is accurate. So at the moment, I think they're stymied by the fact that there are no simple single metrics, and that the monitoring and evaluation is not, they're working on rather than it being a proposal. It's not a very good answer, I don't think, but I think that's the situation. I think they're not sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, go on. You continue, Peter. Sorry.
No, please.
I was going to ask you, that from the Labour manifesto, did that target come from the Dimbleby food strategy, or are they related at all? Where did they come up with that target?
I don't know. It's a manifesto promise. Certainly they were aware of, and I think they're in the current strategy, they're trying not to reinvent the wheel, but they would argue that, the Dimbleby report is now based on dated findings. So I think there's no antipathy to Dimbleby, I think, in the current government, whereas the previous one clearly was antipathetic to it, because there were 19 recommendations, I think, in Dimbleby, of which one was implemented. So that was a real huge amount of public money, time and effort went into it, only to have it sort of shelved. And I think the current government can't do that a second time around. But I think you could see it different ways politically, couldn't you? You could say that, oh, there's no metric, so we can't do anything, not our fault, kind of thing, would be one way of interpreting it. But I don't think that's the case. I think they are trying to find measures that are usable, cost effective, that they could then use should they wish for some kind of incentive payments.
I think if I could just add to that, I think the issue is that, yes, DEFRA would love to be able to pay people for outcomes, but the reality is it's easier to measure the implementation of the practices that they're trying to do to achieve these things. The difficulty is that actually one of the key things and feedback from farmers, I presented some of our results to farmers and they said, well, actually the key thing that's driving differences for them in terms of their yield and productivity is the weather and climate change. And so you need to have a system that allows farmers, rewards them for trying under trying circumstances. So there's possibilities that they do all the things that are correct and best practice in 1 year, and then the weather just cracks up and they don't actually get the improvements and the outcomes that they were hoping for. And part of that is because we don't have a good enough picture of what to apply when necessarily. And so you need to have some way of rewarding them for adapting and changing, which is where certification and getting something that's very rigid is difficult for farmers in the same way that you would have for organic. But you also want to reward farmers that are going above and beyond in actually achieving the outcomes, regardless of the way they're doing it. So there's sort of two sides to the coin, and it's difficult to marry those two things.
Cool. Thank you, Katie and Peter. I did want to ask, but I'll save it for another time, about the nutrition content analysis, Katie, that you mentioned. And also I'd be curious about some of the public health aspects of your work, but maybe I could leave that to another time. We're approaching 2:00 and I know that people will have to get back to class and teaching. Katie and Peter, thank you so much for your time, for a wonderful presentation and a very, very engaging Q&A session. We're very, very grateful to you, and I'm very grateful to my colleagues from the Rhine Institute as well for your attendance and your questions. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you again soon.
Thanks very much for having us.
And thanks for the questions and discussion. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, and bye.
Bye. Bye. See you.